Hello, everyone. My name is Jinha Lee. I'm a professor at the University of Washington Information School and Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs. And I am delighted to introduce today's esteemed lecture. The purpose of this Mignon Distinguished Lecture is to host recognized thought leaders whose expertise resonates with the interest of our iSchool community. And through these lectures, we aim to inspire original and innovative thinking and foster creativity in this intellectual community. The lectureship is generously supported by the kind donation from Molly Mignon, wife of Dr. Ed Mignon. Ed was an information scientist, pianist, composer, and an alum of the University of Washington. He was a dedicated faculty member for over 30 years, and he taught library and information science and was exceptionally talented at teaching courses on information technology. We extend our sincere gratitude to Molly for providing us with this opportunity. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to introduce our guest, Dr. Wendy Chun, as our 2024 Ed Mignon Distinguished Lecturer. Dr. Chun is Simon Fraser University's Canada 150 Research Chair in New Media, professor in the School of Communication, and director of the Digital Democracies Institute. The Digital Democracies Institute at Simon Fraser University is a group of diverse scholars and stakeholders from around the world who collaborate across disciplines, schools, industry, and public sectors to research and create vibrant, democratic technologies and cultures. She has studied both systems design engineering and English literature, which she combines and mutates in her research on digital media. She's an author of many books, including Control and Freedom, Power and Paranoia in the Age of Fiber Optics, Programmed Visions, Software and Memory, Updating to Remain the Same, Habitual New Media, and Discriminating Data, Correlation, Neighborhoods, and the New Politics of Recognition. She has been a professor and chair of the Department of Modern Culture and Media at Brown University, where she worked for almost 2 decades and is currently a visiting professor. She's a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and has also held fellowships from the Guggenheim, ACLS, American Academy of Berlin, Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Chun.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And it's been a pleasure to meet so many of you in individual meetings today. So my talk today is driven by the question, hello, let's wake her up. Okay, there it is. So my talk today is driven by the question, how do humanities and arts-based understandings of human behavior, so understandings drawn from critical theory, psychoanalysis, performance studies, understandings that privilege the embodied, the performative, the limits of computation, how are these related to more instrumentalist understandings of human behavior, which are drawn from the computational social sciences and which are embedded currently within social media metrics and governmentality. And I ask, can people hear me, or do I need to stand by the mic? Do I need to stand by the mic? Yes, I do need to stand by the mic. Okay, I'll stand here. I'm going to stand here. I asked this question because neither portrayals of users as marionettes manipulated by social media wizards who have hacked the human psyche. This is how the dudes in the valley explain social media. Nor celebrations of users as somehow so empowered or so complicated that we're outside the sway of the computational social sciences. Neither of these rings true. But rather than debunking either story, I'm interested in how these might be actually the same, two sides of the same coin. So in particular, how disaffected performativity, so knowing acts which seem somehow transgressive or subversive, how these acts might indeed support the findings of the computational social sciences. And this afternoon, I want us to focus on how the early 20th century factory test room and how the US World War II internment camps ground the social in social media today. And my argument is this, that if our digital devices right now seem both ubiquitous and contained, it's in part due to experiments, experiments to sense the insensible, experiments to capture and discriminate between and among disaffected alien subjectivities, experiments to sow chaos, cooperation, if not love, experiments to breed agents barely undercover, experiments to make surveillance feel like freedom. And this talk draws from my current book project, which is called Sensing AI, Sentiment, Generative Models, and the Returns of Critical Theory. And very briefly, to give you a sense of the larger project, Sensing AI argues that in order to make sense of AI, so in order to understand its possibilities and its limitations and its logic, we need to engage the humanities and critical theory in all its past and current forms, from structuralism to post-structuralism, from gender performativity to trans studies. Okay, now, the usual way that humanities and the AI or critical social sciences and AI are usually discussed, I realize that you all might want to come forward in order to see the screen because it's so small. If anybody wants to get up and move forward, you're very welcome to do so because there's going to be lots of text. So usually when people talk about, critical theory or the humanities and AI, they usually do so in terms of ethical AI, right? So the idea is you add a little bit of the humanities, ta-da, you have ethical AI, right? Which presumes that the humanities are somehow inherently ethical, right? So what I argue instead is that we need to engage critical theory because the roads of machine learning and those of critical theory actually eerily intersect at many points. In many ways, they share the same limitations as well as the same fundamental axioms and concerns. And to make this point, I look at the histories and theories grounding sentiment analysis and affective computing, as well as large language models and generative image models. And today I'm going to concentrate on sentiment analysis, but I'm very happy to talk about this work on large language models during the Q&A. So we've been looking at the really weird resonances between fundamental text within critical theory and fundamental text within natural language processing. But I want to emphasize that our point is to move beyond the resonances. So the point is to move beyond discovering what somebody else already knew, right? And to ask what would happen if these fields worked with each other more intentionally, critically, and creatively in ways that engaged critiques and challenges and formulations within critical theory that's pushed us beyond semiotics. So texts such as Kara Keeling's work on queer times and Black futures, Fred Moten's work on fugitivity as a response to systems of capture, and Jody Bird's work on Indigenomicon, as well as Gayatri Spivak's Echo. I want to stress that this work is collaborative. So Matt Canute, the data scientist at the DDI, and I are running this really weird reading group, which I've talked to several of you about, where we bring these fundamental texts together, which means everybody in the room is confused in a really wonderful way. And my work on sentiment analysis has been deepened by working with both Grace Hong and Lisa Nakamura. And the work on sentiment analysis has just been published in Critical Inquiry. So the part where we look at anti-Asian hate the rise of anti-Asian hate during the pandemic. Okay, so with that all in place, I'm going to start with a seemingly banal question. How are you? How are you? Have you ever thought of how weird it is that we Americans start conversation by asking people, how are you? Because we don't really want or expect an answer, right? So the weirdness of this really hit me when I was living in Germany. And in Germany, I found that these three little words, which were supposed to make conversation easy and light, did the opposite, right? So the checkout person at the grocery store thought I was crazy or American, which for many Germans, I think, are the same. And then my colleagues, rather than saying, fine, how are you, would launch into a 15-minute treatise about their digestion, their relationship status, way too much information. So by the end, we both regretted that I had asked them, right? Now, how are you is usually translated as VGETS. And here you see how VGETS is explained to Americans. We're warned to be careful with VGETS. You can't just say VGETS back. Now, although similar, VGETS and how are you are different. VGETS asks for an objective reply. It goes or it doesn't, right? How are you is all about you, about your sentiment, your feeling, your being. At the same time, though, because we don't want or expect an answer, it presumes disaffection. It presumes disinterest, right? So how are you as a rhetorical question, fine, how are you, presumes that what you have to say and how you feel don't coincide, right? Or more cynically, it makes it so you have something to hide how you actually feel while trying to pry. So that breaking this conventional disaffection, confessing, oversharing, coming clean, shows that you're real or authentic. Right? Now, this is strange, but strangely ordinary, because what I want us to think through for the rest of the talk today is how social media organizes users, not by yelling, hey, you, or saying, move along. So we're not in Althusser's or Rancière's police drama if we ever were. But rather, social media is one constant and creepy, how are you? What's on your mind? Right? How so? Well, to unpack this, let's turn to bossware, right? So due to the pandemic, many of us, of course, started working and teaching and learning remotely. And what began as an exception has, within some circles, become a new North American norm. So according to Forbes magazine, remote work is a permanent feature now. And it's a permanent feature not because businesses can save money on infrastructure, which they clearly can, but rather because working from home allegedly makes workers happier, right? It's better for mental health. Remote work is the future of work because happier employees are nearly twice as likely, as you see here, to work more than 40 hours a week, right? So it's shown as putting a machete to the work-life problem, more work, more life. Right? But there's a problem with this because work from home also provokes a lot of anxiety, right? So managers imagining that their workers are just in bed watching Netflix all day, right? So corporations that are embracing work from home are also increasingly embracing bossware. So bossware is software that logs keystrokes, takes screenshots, records mouse movements, activates webcams and microphones. So according to The Guardian, bossware is coming for all workers, right? We, of course, in the university are very familiar with bossware. So for decades, according to Urban Lore, Stanford professors were told never to type anything in that they didn't want the administration to know because there was keystroke logging software on all university computers, right? But bossware isn't just about surveillance, right? It's not just about what you're doing, it's about prediction. It's about what you could do. So bossware reads everything in and then uses sentiment analysis to figure out your risk score or your risk level. And you're tagged as a potential threat, not only when your sentiment is extremely low, but if your sentiment has radically changed, right? From positive to negative or negative to positive. Okay, but how do they do this? What's sentiment analysis? So sentiment analysis is a task of natural language processing that extracts sentiments and opinions from text, where sentiment is the expression of subjectivity as either negativity or positivity, and either a positive or negative opinion. So it's a form of emotion recognition software, which, along with affective computing, once drove the development of artificial intelligence, right? Now it's considered to be a mature technology, even though, as you'll see, it's extremely error-prone. And even though there have been more patents filed for sentiment analysis software in these past years than ever before. So how does sentiment analysis work? So sentiment analysis entails 3 steps. The first step is to determine whether or not a text is subjective. So sentiment analysis does not address things that are factual, things that are true or false. It has to be identified as an opinion. Second, it detects the text's polarity. So is it positive or negative? And the third step is to see how intensely positive or negative it is. So for example, sentiment analysis takes a tweet like this and determines whether or not it's an opinion. On Twitter, now X, it's safe to consider that all tweets are opinions, which is why in many ways Twitter was made for sentiment analysis and sentiment analysis was made for Twitter. And next, it determines how positive or negative it is. So what you're seeing here are tweets by another Wendy Chun. So there is a Wendy Chun, a Professor Wendy Chun at the University of Miami, who actually tests and develops sentiment analysis systems, right? So life sometimes is stranger than reality, right? Okay, but how does it do this? Well, until recently, there were 2 main approaches to automatic sentiment analysis. One is lexicon-based, so based on dictionaries and rules, and the second, machine learning-based, so models trained on large labeled data sets using humanly and statistically determined features. And many combine the 2. But lexicon-based ones look for certain words, which they score as negative or positive. So as you can see here, good, excellent, masterpiece are positive, bad, terrible, disaster, strongly negative. As well as descriptors, which further determine the intensity of polarity, right? So adjectives such as really, most, arguably, somewhat. These amplify or diminish a score. More recently, sentiment analysis, like so much of everything else, is being done via prompting large language models. So as you can see here, you can take a course to see how sentiment affects stock prices. And sentiment analysis has a long history of being used within economics to understand what's non-rational. And the value of stocks, as we all know, is fundamentally non-rational, right? Now, more recently, what we have to realize again is that sentiment analysis is all about prediction. It's about predicting future sentiments based on past values, and these past values are scraped from the web. Right? So the ground truth of these systems, of these sentiment analysis systems, is the angry tweeter, right? So you can view Elon Musk as our ground truth whenever we use a sentiment analysis system, right? But we have to realize that sentiment analysis isn't just about prediction, it's also about behavioral change, right? So corporations use sentiment analysis to change and organize user behavior. So recall the outrage over a decade ago when it was revealed that Facebook researchers were using sentiment analysis to manipulate people's feeds, right? If you gave them negative content, they would post negative comments, positive, right? They apologized, but this apology misses the point because the point of bossware in these sentiment analysis systems is to change behavior, right? It's to shock workers by letting them know they're being watched. And this would seem to be especially dangerous because sentiment analysis is notoriously error-prone. So Pippa Adams, who's currently a postdoc at the DDI, wrote this brilliant dissertation where she showed that sentiment analysis errs by scoring feminist comments as negative and misogynist comments as positive, right? And think of something like the Proud Boys, right? Everything the Proud Boys tweet is considered to be positive because proud is such a strong token of positivity, right? Now, we have to realize that bossware and sentiment analysis and their limitations aren't new, right? Sentiment analysis has always been failing. It's always been error prone. And sentiment analysis as well has always been about monitoring workers and making them more productive. Bossware isn't the end of sentiment analysis. As we'll see, it's actually the foundation and the beginning. So sentiment analysis is good enough to justify surveillance, right? And it's also because what it discovers is banal. Yes, positive, positive, negative, negative. But it's also bad enough to justify greater surveillance because what it discovers is so banal. But what's important, it's also about making the state of constant surveillance feel like freedom by managing and producing hostility, disaffection, and cooperation, if not loyalty, by constantly asking, how are you? Okay. And this is clear if we look at the history of sentiment analysis, which brings me to part 2, illuminating cooperation. So why do we even care about sentiment? Where does sentiment analysis come from? Well, we think sentiment analysis matters to work because of a series of highly influential and controversial experiments that took place at the Hawthorne Electric factory in Cicero, which is just outside of Chicago, from 1927 to 1932. These experiments were a collaboration between Western Electric and the Harvard Business School. So it's been key to the very formation of the notion of a work-life problem, as well as the formation of the Harvard Business School case study. And so initially, researchers wanted to know the relationship between fatigue and monotony and variables such as temperature, humidity, reduced hours, and free lunches. And so to do so with precision, they placed these 5 women. They placed these 5 women in a test room in which everything was measured and controlled. These women also recorded what they ate, how many hours they slept, and their responsibilities at home. And they also underwent a medical exam every 6 weeks, which they hated. And they also were asked to tell the researchers what they would wish for if they could have one wish. And everything was measured against how many relays these women produced when they allegedly worked freely as they liked, as they felt. Now, these women were under constant surveillance. Their conversations were recorded because there weren't just 5 women in the room. There was also a test room observer. And the initial test room observer, as you see here, was an engineer who had played a key role in making this experiment possible. And he had 2 tasks. One was to keep accurate records of everything that happened in the test room. And the second was to ensure cooperation, to maintain a friendly atmosphere in the test room. Now, this little experiment lasted for 5 years, right? And eventually expanded to interviewing all 20,000 employees within the factory. And it lasted so long and became so extensive because what happened was both completely expected and unexpected. So at first, as you imagine, you give people shorter hours and free lunches and they become more productive. Right? But then the executives had an idea. They said, let's take away all these benefits and see what happens. And in that 3-month period in which everything was taken away, productivity was still high. So something else mattered. What was this something else? Well, the experiment fundamentally changed how these women were paid. So usually, as you see here, they worked in groups of about 100 women. And their pay depended on the rate of their group, which was 100. So here with 5, they had far more control over their wages, right? But the experimenters thought it was more than money, right? This was Harvard Business School. Couldn't be as easy as pay people more, right? We had to think beyond the paycheck here. So they selected another 5 women, and all they did was change the pay structure, and productivity went up, but not by that much, right? Then they selected a group of 9 linemen. They took these linemen, they put them in a special test room, gave them all these privileges, and productivity never changed, right? Because they were deeply suspicious of these researchers, right? And so they were disaffected in ways that a lot of these experiments were designed to try to overcome, right? So what was responsible for the difference? Well, according to the researchers, the difference was worker sentiment. Their great discovery was that the behavior of workers couldn't be understood outside of their feelings or sentiments, and that the meanings that workers put to changes were far more important than the changes themselves. And the meaning of these changes always stemmed from their feelings rather than objective conditions. Right? Now, intriguingly, it's the women themselves provided this answer. So in response to the question, what do you think has made it possible for you to increase your earnings since you've been on the test, they stated greater freedom, the absence of bosses, more personal attention, the opportunity to set one's own pace and to earn what one makes without being held up by a big group. So these women, according to these researchers, were having fun. And here you see their recorded banter. Now, if these women were having fun, they were having fun in the oddest of circumstances. So these women, as T.N. Whitehead, and T.N. Whitehead is, yes, the son of the Whitehead. So in many ways, we can view sentiment analysis as the offspring of process philosophy, right? So according to T.N. Whitehead, these women were far more supervised than they had ever been in the regular department. So they were watched by an observer of their own. Interested management went by all the time. They had professors from Harvard and MIT regularly visiting them, right? But according to the researchers, the difference was that these women knew that they were taking part in an important experiment, and they were consulted about every decision. So this experiment has also become famous for what in the 1950s has been called the Hawthorne effect. So the idea that subjects change their performance on a test in response to the knowledge of being observed, right? So this is decades before Foucault's Discipline and Punish. Right? Now, according to these researchers, what had happened was that these women had committed themselves to accomplishing the impossible. Because they were being observed, they committed themselves to always increasing output no matter what conditions. Maybe. But what's key is that this miraculous result almost didn't happen. Right? So this miracle was only possible because the company actually kicked out 2 of the original workers. So they kicked out worker 1A and 2A for being uncooperative, for actually working as they felt. So when workers 1A and 2A, their productivity didn't go up after they were given free lunches, et cetera, they were threatened. But they were kicked out because, as you see here, they spoke to each other in Polish about the other women in the test room. Right? And 4 out of the 5 original workers were Polish American. The 5th was Norwegian, and her productivity remained the same, no matter, similar no matter what happened. And there's a lot to say about this because these experiments were really experiments of white Americanization. And Cicero, Illinois was a sundown town. And it was only until after World War II that the factory actually hired Black Americans. Now, things really started cooking and the Hawthorne effect took place when they replaced operator 2A with an Italian American. And she basically took the experiment over. She pushed everyone else to work harder. She was the most educated, the most ambitious, and she was also the main breadwinner out of the group. So shortly after the experiment began, her mother died. She had to support her brothers and father, both financially and domestically. And as she put it, she needed the money. Now, there's a ton to say about these experiments because they're not only the beginnings of sentiment analysis, they're also the beginnings of topic modeling as well as network analysis. And what's key is that everything we know now that doesn't work about these methods was also discovered and documented then. Right? But I want to stop here to sketch how sentiment analysis moved from governing workers to how it moved to governing occupied peoples and territories under stress, which brings me to part 3, interning aliens. So during World War II, the US interned all Japanese Americans and Japanese nationals living on the West Coast. So living in Seattle, Vancouver, because the Canadians did this as well. But notably, they didn't do the same for Italians or Germans. And now this decision to intern all people, irregardless of their citizenship status, was openly and explicitly and unapologetically racist. It was linked to both racist beliefs in Oriental inscrutability and in the biological loyalties of the Japanese. Right? So General John DeWitt, who oversaw the US internment, argued that they had to intern all the Japanese because, as you see here, there's no way to determine their loyalty. It makes no difference whether he's an American citizen, he's still a Japanese. You needn't worry about the Italians at all, except in certain cases. Also the same for Germans, except in individual cases. But we must worry about the Japanese all the time until he's wiped off the map. Or most succinctly, as he said in a press conference, a Jap's a Jap, right? There's no way to discern between them and no need. And as you see here, no evidence could ever exonerate them. So the fact that nothing had happened was evidence that something even more catastrophic was going to happen. Now, DeWitt's openly racist attitude wasn't the only one. And in this last section, I want to outline how this openly racist opinion was resisted by social scientists. Social scientists who viewed this overtly racist opinion as both costly and inefficient, and also due to researcher laziness. Okay. And they sought to counter this through sentiment analysis. Sentiment analysis, which allowed them to pose as surrogate friends of Japanese Americans, and thus to overcome Oriental inscrutability. To understand Japanese and Japanese Americans, to discern individual and cultural sentiments, and to be able to discern the loyal from the disloyal, and thus to manage and govern these and future interned people through a post-racist racism, right? So these social scientists were not against the internment, but thought of using sentiment analysis and other techniques in order to make this internment more, quote unquote, humane. And to make this point, I'll talk about the Bureau of Sociological Research, which was run by psychiatrist Alexander Layton at Poston. And Poston was the largest internment camp in the US, and it, like many others, was built, very poorly built, on what was then called Indian reservations. And so Poston was managed both by the Office of Indian Affairs and the War Relocation Agency. Now, what's key is that these camps weren't supposed to be like concentration camps. They were supposed to be, to some extent, self-governed. Japanese Americans were encouraged to work, to become independent, and thus gain self-respect. And they were encouraged to do this so they could embody the difference, the democratic difference between Allied and Axis countries. So these camps, like reservations, were viewed then as exceptional sites of democracy. So the goal of these camps, as Brian Hayashi has pointed out, was to democratize the enemy by literally, as Jody Bird has pointed out, transiting through the Indian. And in Layton's sociological journal, he relays this really crazy episode in which Collier, who was then head of the Office of Indian Affairs, stood in front of all the internees and everyone responsible for keeping the internees interned, and said, you all are responsible for making Poston a success. And by success, he meant making Poston representative not of what American democracy is, but what American democracy could be. And intriguingly, Leighton, in his sociological journal, thinks that the internees weren't convinced by this rhetoric and instead viewed themselves as guinea pigs that were captured by the US government for this psychological and social experiment. But regardless, Leighton argued that this social experiment was crucial to the US taking on challenges it would face after World War II, namely governing occupied lands. So these camps would be key to understanding and dealing with disintegrating communities. So mass relocations as democratic method. So these camps weren't about bare life. They were about neoliberal life. And many of the methods that were developed here would go on and be implemented by the US government. So Leighton was actually in charge of the research unit that visited Hiroshima after the bombing to assess the sentiment of those who had been bombed and survived. Now, these camps, like reservations, were also and relatedly sites of applied sociological study. So it was because the Office of Indian Affairs was in charge that Leighton was hired. Collier hired Leighton because he had previously studied Navajo and Inuit communities. And Leighton's initial goals, as you see here, were one, to aid the administration by analyzing the attitudes of the evacuees with particular reference to the responses to administrative acts, and to draw practical conclusions as to what worked well and what did not work so well and why. And two, to gather data of a general character that might be of value in the administration of dislocated communities in occupied areas. And because of the level of suspicion that was directed towards members of the Bureau of Sociological Research, so to a lot of people, the BSR, Bureau of Sociological Research, sounded a lot like the Federal Bureau of Investigation, right? Their third goal was to train field workers of Japanese ancestry in social analysis so that they would be helpful in occupied areas of the Pacific during or after the war. So the point was to train undercover agents. Now, to do so, they used a five-pronged approach that almost exactly foreshadows what social media companies do today. So the first was general observation, spread about the community in as many strategic spots as possible. The research staff observed and recorded what people were saying in conversations around their homes, in the mess halls, in the shower rooms, at the doorsteps in the evening, and similar places. In each observation, it was considered desirable to note the following points. What were the sentiments expressed by word or action? What were the circumstances under which these occurred? What were the emotional tones and implications of the principal persons expressing and responding to the sentiments? What kinds of people were involved? What happened as a result? As part of the general observation, various meetings for political, social, religious, and recreational purposes were covered and carefully described. The daily paper and other published material was also scanned and notes made on the content. So this is basically contemporary sentiment analysis. As well, there were intensive interviews. This comes from the Hawthorne experiments. 3, the collection of records. So as this implies, every record possible was read and scanned. 4, public opinion polls. So there were weekly public opinion polls. This is a time when Gallup was starting to develop his method, and they were perfected in these camps. And 5, personality studies. So well before Cambridge Analytica, the idea that we need to understand personality types. Right? Now, although Poston was the first to have a Bureau of Applied Sociological Research, these divisions soon became an important part of every single internment camp. And they became so important because these camps didn't become model communities filled with model minorities, right? So Japanese Americans became quote unquote model minorities after they transited through these camps. So if in the wild, there was no sabotage or subversive action, in the camp, there were actually general strikes and violence and discontent. And this is because not only were these camps poorly built, so the folks in the camp called Postin 1, 2, and 3 Roastin, Toastin, and Dustin. And also the wages that were offered to the internees were not only extremely low, half the time they weren't paid. Because as Leighton notes, half of the administrators of Postin thought it should be run like a concentration camp. Now, things broke down in November of 1942 with a general strike in Postin 1. And this general strike was supported by many who had initially supported and worked with the administration. And the Bureau of Sociological Research credited itself with turning this crisis into an opportunity. So working against the more overtly racist administrators, the heads of the research project gave it as their opinion that if the administration negotiated carefully, it would come out of the situation with much better influence in the community than it had previously wielded. Whereas if it used force, there would be violence, loss of life, the permanent alienation of many hitherto cooperative residents, and a costly disruption of the community lasting many months. So the administration followed their advice, and as you see here, within a few weeks, cooperation between the people and the governing body was markedly closer and more efficient than it had ever been. And the BSR was so successful, according to Leighton, because they used sentiment analysis to shape the future. Sentiment was so key because, as this diagram shows, and this is Leighton's revision of Roethlisberger's diagram, so the diagram that came from the women workers, it was so important because sentiment determined the success of any response to change. So sentiment, allegedly analogous to the conditional reflexes studied extensively in lower animals, was key to successful social engineering under conditions of captivity and stress. So what this means is that women operators and Japanese American internees lie at the heart of sentiment analysis. So they're central to current forms of social media analysis, manipulation, and research, to projections and mappings of social media subjectivities, as well as those creepy friendships that exploit those that they supposedly befriend and protect. Okay. So at the heart of all of this lie disaffected peoples who are deliberately disrupted and reorganized and constantly asked, how are you? Okay. Now, if this is so, what's absolutely key and what I want us to end with is that we realize that what's read as authentic or real or truthful is anything but. So no matter how literal sentiment analysis might be or claims to be, it, like asking somebody, how are you, right, always invokes a gap between what's inside and outside, between what's manifest and latent, even as it seeks to overcome this gap. But this gap never entirely disappears, even and especially under conditions of disintegration, captivity, and stress. So the Italian-American operator, again, was an operator. She and her colleagues knew that their actions would affect the conditions of all the other workers. In fact, they were considered to be minor celebrities within the factory. You might view them as some of the earliest influencers. Right? And as if they were breadcrumbing things for the researchers, they chatted constantly about films and the films they liked and roles they liked the whole time, right? And in many ways, they survived surveillance by treating their monitors as an audience. And Leighton's history of the camp and the role that the BSR played was also challenged by evacuees. So I end with a passage from Richard Nishimoto. And Richard Nishimoto was a subject of a personality study and one of Leighton's disaffected researchers. So he left the project because he hated Leighton. But then he joined a project that was led by Berkeley. So there were 3 different sociological studies happening at the same time at posting, right? And this is what he submitted to Leighton as his personality study. So he starts by mocking Leighton and his lurid interest in his subjects. So, well, doctor, don't you think we better go in now? The overture of the 2nd act has begun, you know. Oh, yes, I know that you've been studying the personality traits of the lady standing over there. But don't you think you've been looking at her long enough? You've been glaring at her for the last 15 minutes, you know. Yes, yes, I know she's beautiful, glamorous, and all that, but I think the leading character of the drama is more interesting. So Nishimoto's engagement with himself and his colleagues as characters, objects of Leighton's gaze, underscores the extent to which sentiment analysis provokes characters and drama, including disaffection, rather than simply revealing what's there. Right, so the scene is set. We're characters, not marionettes, in this drama so poorly called machine learning. And the question before us is, how might therefore an embrace of disaffected authenticity as disaffection, lead elsewhere, even as disaffection is the point and not resistance? Even as acting disaffectedly as undercover agents makes predictive and generative algorithms run more smoothly. And lastly, by engaging rather than ignoring this history, these worlds and these theoretical settings, how might we reimagine and recreate the social embedded within our media technologies? Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful talk, Dr. Chun. I think we might have some time for a couple of questions from the audience, if there's any.
If there aren't, there's also video I can show of our data fluencies project to show you how we're trying to answer these questions, which I'm very happy to show as well. So.
Thank you very much for the talk, really fascinating. I'm wondering how much you're looking at negative sentiment, thinking about the no-no boys and other resistance groups during internment camps and what they might have shown these researchers.
Yeah. Yeah, no, the no-no boys are so important, especially if you consider the ways in which the very notion of no-no was linked to these tests of loyalty in terms of who would be released or not. We're looking at questions of negative sentiment in a few ways. So one is through current work. So this research is being led by Evan Donahue and Adjoa. And what they're looking at are the ways in which these bossware companies claim to be able to discern negative sentiment and the implications of negative sentiment. And they're looking at this one case, which is called the Karen case. And so one bossware company has claimed to have cracked negative sentiment by showing that negative sentiment of workers is linked to Karen cases. And so we're looking at the same subreddits that they've been looking at and trying to figure out what exactly they have been finding. And so they sell their software by saying, you know, what we found are, you know, words like manager are really positive and words like co-worker are really negative, right? And so this is why you want their software. But what's interesting is that words that they don't show, like team, are actually the most positive according to their own analysis. So part of it is to try to decipher how positive or negative works within the world of sentiment analysis. And the other work, which is more historical, and this I'm doing with Lisa Nakamura, and Lisa Nakamura's family were actually in internment camps. And so she has some of the traces from her uncle and other family members, is to go through this archive and to see what different story it tells than the simple reading of sentiment as revealing the sort of animal instincts of Japanese Americans.
Thank you again for this excellent talk. It was incredibly elucidating. I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about how you see disaffected authenticity manifesting on social media. You sort of draw our attention to the idea of these languages at the end, but I'd love to hear you talk more about it.
Yeah. So part of this is I'm really inspired by the work of both, I'm not sure if you can see it here, Jin Yao and Tanya Egocleus, and others who have been thinking through disaffection as modes of engagement. In particular, they've been looking at it within the frame of post-colonial studies as well as Indigenous and Asian American studies. And trying to understand, so there's two ways in which the sort of project of enlightenment and racial science is told. One is through the enlightenment and rationality and the fact that only certain people could be rational humans. The other story, and you can think through Lauren Berlant's work amongst others, is that it wasn't simply reason, but it was also that others didn't have the proper affect. They were either too affected or had zero affect. Right? And the notion of who was truly human depended on the notion of well-regulated affect. And what's been really important about this work on disaffection has been to call that into question and to understand how modes of disaffection were key to modes of resistance and also modes of intervention. And I think I'm inspired by that work, but I'm also putting that in relationship to work that I'm less inspired by and more questioning of, which is the whole move towards Bartleby. Right? I prefer not to, as the mode of resistance that we need to all engage. You know, I prefer not to. And Wendy Lee has written this brilliant book in which she argues that the history of the novel is actually the history of people who, by being unmoved, move others. So Bartleby isn't a new instantiation. Rather, she looks at the history of the novel in terms of, first of all, the figure of the prude, Cursa, who by not moving moves others and creates this desire for narrative and intrusiveness, right? So therefore, trying to understand the ways in which certain forms of disaffection create seemingly more intrusive forms of narrative and examination. And so part of this work is to say that the way disaffection is being currently thought of as forms of resistance in terms of Bartleby is actually part of this longer tradition of prying and the inspiration of surveillance. But at the same time, disaffection, especially within the work of Zhao and Egocleus, also points to a different mode of occupying the space. But one thing we have to realize is that disaffection isn't outside of some of the findings of the computational social sciences, because there's also a way in which often people frame the humanities as having a more complicated and nuanced and insightful view of human behavior, which couldn't possibly be reduced to algorithmic understandings, right? But what fascinates me is we can have these complicated, nuanced understandings of what we're doing that nonetheless make these generative and predictive algorithms work perfectly, right? Because we're enacting, performing, et cetera, et cetera. So how, rather than viewing these things as opposed, can we actually view them as supporting each other in ways that we need to think through?
Thank you. No, go ahead. Amazing talk. I have a question about this sort of speaking of disaffection. And the period that you're talking about with the Hawthorne studies is also one in which like pacing and slacking becomes a really important kind of industrial action, especially in places that either are not yet unionized or where various conformity striking laws, because it's a kind of disavowal disaffection. And then by the time you get to the 40s, at least from what I've read with like small electronics manufacturer, which I think this is, it's like, pacing becomes a point of solidarity. So when like the time motion study comes in, everyone says, oh, you better not fast, right? Because otherwise, then it's setting a standard that everyone else will have to meet, right? So I'm just curious as to like how this is like an empirical facts question. How is productivity measured in these studies? Like, what's the benchmark that the 5 women who are observed for 5 years are held to, and the kind of tasks they're being given, and then if they're kind of influencers, and if they really are increasing productivity, everyone else in the company needs them, right? And like they're being held to a certain stuff, maybe like so I'm curious as to hearing more about like what the actual tasks that were being studied were, and also like if there's a relationship between these studies and other forms of disaffection, like slacking or pacing or sick power.
Yeah. Yes. So what's fascinating about these studies, so first it's the measurement is how many relays that these women can produce. Like a telegraphic relay. Yeah. So so it's fine work, right? And what's so fascinating about these studies, which take place from 27 to 32, is that they're shown and taken up as revealing the limits of scientific management and revealing the limits of economic understandings of worker behavior. And so pacing, slacking, and this is also related to the bogeyman, which was used to determine wages as well. That's prominent in the linemen and what the linemen are doing. So this study was taken up as like, finally, we can move away from these forms, which are frustrating all forms of true scientific management. What's intriguing is that during this time, there's not only the threat of unionization, but also the threat of the Great Depression. And these are being negotiated at the same time. And what's fascinating is that Whitehead then goes on to write the book Leadership in the Free World, in which he argues that we need businessmen to become political leaders in the United States of America. And because we all know how well that turns out. And it's framed in terms of freedom. So within all of this is this quote unquote understanding of freedom, but it's also, again, understanding of white Americanization, because the 5 other women who aren't put in a test room, but their productivity changes slightly according to the change of the pay structure, were German Americans who had better jobs. They weren't producing relays, they were doing another function. And what's recorded throughout is our discussions about Americanization, struggles with immigrant families. It becomes this entirely different backdrop to the conversations, and it's explicitly so in terms of also the segregation of neighborhoods according to Polish versus German, and everything is laid out in Italians and Catholics versus Protestants. That all happens within the framework of understanding the cracking of sentiment as well. So here, I think Ira Katz-Nelson's work as well on the role that ethnicity plays and doesn't play in the workplace is key, although that comes much later than these studies. But they are fascinating in terms of their framework as we have now understand why Taylorism doesn't work.
Because I was thinking that this notion of freedom, so
Right.
They have more freedom like a working home person,
Right.
So they enjoy their work when they're more productive. But like, what precisely constitutes freedom in this study? Is it like the work process itself, like they're free to order and conduct it? No, not that. So what is it?
The alleged freedom is that there's no bosses. So even though there is a test room observer, it makes no sense, right? Okay, let's think about this. They are in the most surveilled space possible, but it's framed as you are free because you don't have your normal boss yelling at you all the time. Yeah, but it is kind of freedom as in the free world in terms of how it was being framed at the time. And what's fascinating is that throughout these studies is an investigation of freedom as well, in terms of but this becomes after World War II, when these researchers start reframing these studies in terms of communism versus capitalism. But even there, within the context of unionization, I mean, there's things are said like either we ask them or somebody else is going to ask them how they feel, right? So there's these studies are crazy. They literally are crazy. And like, there's tomes upon tomes of what they recorded and what they didn't record. This is also where they start tracking the influence of friendship on productivity. So they show that friends' productivity are correlated. And then they start doing all sorts of weird analysis of, especially for the linemen, it matters where they are in the room, who they're friends with, who they talk to, insider, outsider. And again, all the limitations come out as well. So first they start with these interviews of just taking notes. And then it said, no, we need transcription. So then they go by word by word by word in order to understand what's going on. And then they say, no, that's not enough because everything we know about sentiment analysis depends on context, et cetera, et cetera. And so then they start publishing parts of these interviews. And it's all about these male workers who have problems with their fathers and authority figures, therefore having problems with their managers. And so they say, even though this isn't about psychoanalysis, it's all about these, male authority figures. So the dimension of gender as well that's being transgressed here and thought here, but the great thing about the sentiment of women is cracking the authoritarian male figure. I mean, if anybody wants to sit with these, they are fascinating. You could spend years reading these things, and they are incredible. Son of process philosophy. All I gotta say.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chun, for the excellent talk and also this great engagement. There'll be a reception that follows in this room until 6:30-ish. So I hope you will stay and continue to engage in this conversation. Thank you all for coming tonight. And let's thank Dr. Chun again.
Yeah.